Hi everyone, how you doing? My name's Ross. Welcome again to Total Immunology. And today what we're going to do is do a more of a foundation talk to discuss about what you are made of. And I realize for some people this would be super easy. So if you don't want to watch this video, that's absolutely fine. But it becomes a very, very important issue when trying to explain bigger concepts if we don't understand the different materials that we are made of as human beings, or even actually as animals or plants, really. It won't take very long, and we're just going to go through and talk about all the different types and approximate functions of these different things. So I don't want people thinking that this is the be all and end all of all the detail. This is a rough revision guide as we go through. Okay, I'm not going to waste any more time, and let's go straight on and have a look at it. So the first thing that you have to think about is what type of core materials do we have? And so the biggest and probably the most important core material when it comes to energy is going to be sugar. And we can call sugar a few different things. One of the things we can call it is a monosaccharide, which means it's one single unit of sugar. And the most classic example of that is going to be glucose. And you can see here what glucose looks like from a chemical structure point of view. Just in case you're not familiar with these, the O's stand for oxygen, the H's stand for hydrogen, and the C's stand for carbon. And when you see the black lines, that indicates that we have a bond, some sort of chemical bond that is making those two atoms stick together. So they form these cyclical structures that we can form together. And what we can also find is that we can put multiple of these subunits together, and that makes what we call a polysaccharide. And so a good example of a polysaccharide is going to be starch. So if you think about sugar, you can see it in two different ways. You can see it in those white cubes, in the pure sugar that you would have put in your tea or your coffee, or you can see it as a more complex design, and that could be something like bread. Now, bread is not purely made of polysaccharides. Of course, it has other things in it like gluten, which is a protein, but we often now start to think of carbohydrates, rice or pasta or bread, all coming from this same concept, okay, where they have lots of stored up sugar molecules that are bound together. So the next one, as I'd already hinted at, is protein. And protein again follows the same concept. It has a small subunit that can be built together to make larger subunits. And the smallest subunit of protein we have is called an amino acid. Amino acids look slightly different. You can see that they have two other letters in there. We have an N, which stands for nitrogen, and we have an R. Now, the R is not an atom in its own right, it's not an element. It represents where the difference is because we have multiple different types of amino acid. We have 20, in fact, in humans, and we can have others in other animal species as well that are often used. And what we have here is three examples of those. And really, all that comes down to for them that makes them different is the fact that their R group will be something that changes with each one of those. We classically say that amino acid has two different ends to it. It has what we call a carboxyl group, which is where you can see the C's and the O's and the H's, and it has what we call the amino group, which is important because that's the bit that gets broken down in your body and goes into what makes your urine. Again, you can pull this together and you see you can build more complex proteins based on putting together combinations of your amino acids. And depending on those combinations of those amino acids, you will actually make that polypeptide form a different shape, a different three-dimensional shape because of all the different forces that may stick them together. And you can see one example there where we see something called a sulfide bridge caused by two cysteine amino acids, and you can see that there in the diagram. That's one example of how we can see things start to bind together. So where do we tend to see protein? We can see it in two different forms. You can see two different forms on that plate. You can see a piece of chicken there that's been cooked up. So animal muscle tissue is predominantly where we see our protein exist. And if we other animals, we get that protein from them. But the other way we can get it is from vegetables as well. And there's two vegetables on that plate that you can see that are highly packed in protein. And one of them is that green bean, and one of them is the green pea. So what we technically say is that legumes are a type of plant that is high in protein. It's a way that that plant species has evolved to utilize protein more. The final big type of material that we use is fat. And again, fat has different subunits that can be built up, but actually it's slightly different to the other two because you have different forms of fat and sometimes they can compound together. So one small form of fat we can have is glycerol, and you can see it here again. It's mainly, again, the C's, the O's, and the H's. It's what we call a hydrocarbon, and it builds together. And you can have multiple versions of these put together. And if you put them with fatty acid chains, you can start to see this bigger molecule on the right-hand side called a triglyceride. And this is where we start to see larger fat molecules being put together. Where can we see fat in what we use? Well, you can see fat commonly in when we start to see things like oils, which is where we can see a form of fat that doesn't form a solid at room temperature, and we can see also in things like dairy fat. So we can see butter, okay, or cream, things like that. So all those dairy forms that you see when you're producing milk, milk has a level of fat in it. And by taking away and separating and fractionating and treating that fat, you can change it into different versions of whatever you would like. Butter being one, you can also, as I said, make cream from it. You can take all the fat away and just have the protein and the water, and then you have things like skimmed milk, which has a bit of sugar and a bit of water and a bit of protein in it, and then a lot of the fat has been removed. So you can do different things with the dairy. When it comes to oils, we can get oils to be formed from animal fat, but actually predominantly we see oils being formed from vegetable fat. So we can have olive oil, we could have sunflower seed oil. So these oils are coming from those plant sources, and they hold a liquid form at room temperature rather than a solid form. And when we look at sugars and proteins, we don't tend to see that that different option of having a liquid or a solid form. We tend to see something that will be usually only solid um, at that point. Now, it doesn't mean that everything we use only exists in those forms, because that's not true. What we tend to find we tend to have foodstuffs that have a combination of those things. So we can have, for example, eggs. Eggs are a great source of protein and fat. That's predominantly what they have inside them. And so if you eat the egg, if you look at the egg yolk, it will have a lot of fat in it. If you look at the egg white, it has a lot of protein in it. If you take things that we particularly like to eat all the time, such as cakes and biscuits, they tend to have this magical combination of sugar and fat, which are the two things that we really enjoy, and our brain rewards us for eating a lot of the time, if you have a sweet tooth, especially. We can get things that have sugar and protein. They're not as common, but they do exist, and they're usually in the form of jelly. In case you didn't know, and this may ruin them for you, but predominantly, if you don't have vegetarian gummy sweets, those vegetarian gummy sweets will have protein because they've been taken from animal bone marrow. That's where we get the gelatin. That's what gelatin is. It comes from a particular type of protein source that we can get from bone marrow. And if you add lots of sugar to it, you can have lots of tasty things. Another example could be meringue, where you're taking egg white with lots and lots of protein in it and adding it up with sugar to balance it out and make it sweet and have that bizarre texture and chewy texture on it. So we've now talked about all these different types of material that we have, but what do they predominantly do for us? Each one of those materials is something that we need to have for a reason. And what's the primary reason that we need them? Sugar, the simplest idea about sugar is its energy. It is a highly potent source of energy that can be quick release, and that's why I've got a picture of these people who are sprinting. It can be slow release because we can put it in a more complex form, like a sandwich or rice, which means that our body will break it down and it will release that glucose slower. So it will be partially released all the time. If you eat a Mars bar, which is packed full of just glucose, you're going to have a massive burst of that energy to start with, but then it's all gone. And in some ways, your body will physiologically not appreciate it and will try and control it because it doesn't like to have too much of that glucose in its blood at any one time. So, sugar has one role and one role only: energy. It's very important for us to have. It's not impossible for us to not have it. We can live on other sources, as I will show in a minute, but it's something that our body enjoys having. The second thing that we have on here is protein. And protein has one core role as well. And its core role is structure. It's a building block. It's a thing that we use for our muscle tissue. If we don't have muscles, we can't move our bones because our muscles are the things that help guide and move our bones mechanically around where we need them to be. And if you don't have your bones moving, you can't move your limbs or any of your spine or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. At a molecular level, it's also very important because it helps build all the finer things that we need built inside each of our cells. And so I've got a picture here of a receptor, and we've talked about this receptor in other talks, and we're going to talk about it in future talks. But if you don't have receptors built, and they don't have a clear three-dimensional shape, and I come back to what I said about those polypeptides, then they're not going to be able to function, because the point of a receptor is it has to try and fit only specific shaped things. And so we need this concept that different amino acids built together will form clear three-dimensional shapes. And if we're talking about the immune system is absolutely pivotal. Its success is pivotal on a good three-dimensional shape recognition. The final one that we have here is fat, and fat is something that we can use for a few different things, but we mustn't forget something that I think get overlooked quite a lot about fat. It gets a bit of a bad rap, but fat is very important because it forms big structural concepts for you. Your every single cell in your body has a membrane around it. That membrane is made of fat. So if you don't have any fat in your body, you cannot make the membranes of new cells. It's really, really important. The other thing that it does is it forms particular key structural elements on things for nerve cells. So a lot of your nerve cells, if you think of them like electrical wires have to have insulation around the outside of them, otherwise the electricity jumps out of the wire. Exactly the same thing for a nerve cell. Okay, it has a thing called Schwann cells that have to go around the outside and form a myelin sheath. And sometimes we talk about bad things happening to nerve cells, which are called demyelinating diseases, and that is where those insulating sheaths start to get broken down and we start to see the nerves fail to fire off in the correct manner. So really important in the nervous system to have fat. There are loads of other, of course, reasons for having fat in your body as well that I'm not going to bring up in here, but there are lots of good reasons. Now, fat can also have something that protein struggles to do. It's not impossible for protein to do it, but it's not as easy, and your body would prefer to use fat first. And that is that if you don't have enough sugar in your body at any one time, you can break down fat to turn it into an energy source, which can include producing some equivalent of what you see with sugar. So you can utilize fat to break down to provide energy for your body. And you will do that in various different states of exercise and also at varying different amounts of sugar level in your body. If you don't have enough sugar, it's going to turn to fat as a fuel. And fat comes with a trade-off. It's a good fuel source in one way, but it can also produce breakdown products which your body don't particularly enjoy, but they can learn to cope with. So there are lots of people out there who really have no sugar in their diet at all, and they live on a ketone diet, and that means that they are producing breakdown products from fat metabolism instead, and they are able to operate on that. And it often means you will run around with a very low body fat content, unless you're eating an enormous amount of food every day to be able to run this system, because you won't be eating any sugar. Now, what happens if you eat any one of these things too much? If you eat too much sugar or too much fat or too much protein, what eventually happens? In all cases, if you eat too much of it, some of it you will excrete. You will poo it or you will wee it, but you won't wee or poo all of it, most likely. And your body is designed, because it's designed to live like a caveman, not like a person who lives in a comfortable first world country or even a lower middle income country where you're still getting enough food. Is the idea that says, if I've got too much of it, I shouldn't get rid of some. I might need it for the future. So let's store it up, because technically the body doesn't know where its next meal's coming from. You do. You've already planned it. You bought it in the supermarket a week ago, so you've got a week's worth of food. But your body doesn't technically know that. So your body will now store that food in anticipation of there being a massive famine. And where's it going to store that? It's going to store that as a layer of fat on your body. So from your body's perspective, it turns around and goes, great, I've got this extra energy store that I can hold on to and do what I want to do. If there's any level of lack of body positivity in your psyche, you will not be happy with this fat layer on your body, and so you will get uncomfortable with it. That's for every individual to decide how much they want to have on them. But what we do know is that long term, too much fat layer content on your body is not good for you. And I'm not going to go into that at any greater level. What else do we have? Those are not the only things. They're the three major things we have. Do we have anything else? Yes, we do. We have things like metal ions. Okay, there are lots and lots and lots of different metal ions that are integral to our life. And some of those things we don't appreciate sometimes as metals, but they are metals. Calcium is technically an alkali metal. Okay, it's not a traditional metal that we would think of. But ironically, if you don't have calcium in your body, you're going to have a big problem, because your body uses it for other structures, bones and teeth being the most clear cut structural component of your body that uses calcium in its framework. So if you don't have enough calcium, you're going to suffer from big issues. The most extreme issues you're going to suffer from are basically going to be osteoporosis, where your bones start to become very thin and hollow and fragile, and you're likely to break more often. Other really important ion is a traditional metal ion that we would think of, and that is iron. So not ion, I-O-N, but iron, R-I-R-O-N. And iron is integral to the formation of one of the most important proteins in your blood, which is hemoglobin. If you don't have hemoglobin, which is the core pigment and component of a red blood cell, you can't move oxygen around your body. It's as simple as that. So if you're low in iron, you often will become anemic. And if you become anemic, what does it look like? You often become very tired and breathless. Why are you tired and breathless? Because you can't move any oxygen around your body very easily. Okay, it's very simple. So iron is another really important thing that you have to take in on your diet. You can't synthesize calcium or iron. You have to take them from something that you have eaten. And so these things have become very important. It's often why, if you look at your vitamin A to Z packets, you will see all of these different things in there. There are loads of them. They are also important sometimes at a molecular level, again, like protein. Calcium is integral to the immune system because if you don't have calcium ions moving across a cell membrane, it will trigger problems with regards to having receptors activate and downstream proteins from a cascade of molecules being able to do their mode of action. We're going to talk about what a intracellular cascade looks like in a future talk. So just in case, but hold that thought. The final thing that we have are what are called vitamins. Vitamins is a bit of a vague word. It's an umbrella term, really. And so a lot of people don't really think about what it means. There are loads and loads and loads of different types of vitamins. I'm only showing here what we call the B vitamins, but there are D and E, for example, and vitamin A. All right. So there are lots of others, and you can go and find them very easily and look them up. But effectively, what they are specific compounds, chemical compounds that your body requires and cannot synthesize itself. And the majority of them are taken from your diet. The vast majority of them are taken from your diet. And if you have a deficiency in any one of these compounds, you will end up with some form of pathology. You will end up with a condition that is not favorable to you. And we know some extreme ones. So, vitamin C, we know is associated with something called scurvy. If you have a lack of vitamin D, it is associated with something called rickets. So, these things all start to affect you as time goes on. Most of them, as I said, come from the diet. Some of them come from other sources. So we take vitamin D, for example, you can get it from sunlight. So sunlight on your skin can lead to a biochemical metabolic process that can lead to you being able to synthesize vitamin D from that. But you can't synthesize it without that sunshine. So before you feel like I've contradicted myself, I haven't. You still need an outside source of something to help drive it. And most of the time, that is you just take it in your diet and you can supplement from that angle. What else do we have? We have one final thing we need to always put into the mix here, and that is a material called nucleic acid. Now, nucleic acid itself is not a primary material. It is made up of other things. There are proteins involved in it, and there are things called bases and nucleotide bases. These are, again, just simple compounds. They can be constructed. You can synthesize them yourself, but you need other things to help you do it. Okay, so you might need things like folic acid, and there you can see vitamin B9 is really important in being able to help do DNA synthesis and DNA regulation. Nucleic acid can exist as what's called ribonucleic acid, RNA, or it can exist as deoxyribonucleic acid, which is called DNA. Ribonucleic acid or RNA is much more fragile, it's much more primitive. We use it sometimes, but not very often. We prefer the more evolved and superior version, which is called DNA. It's more stable. Okay, it means that we can have it, leave it on a tabletop, and you can still find it sometime later. Hence why forensic pathology use it a lot to be able to catch criminals. What is the point of nucleic acid? It has one point and one point only. It's where you store the code of how to build everything else, namely, and most importantly, the proteins. You can't build any protein that your body makes, and you make thousands, tens of thousands of different types of protein in your system, and each one of them has an instruction booklet. And that instruction booklet is tied up in that nucleic acid. If you don't have that nucleic acid, you can't build the booklet. How do we know this is true? Very simple. If you have a genetic mutation, which means that you're missing one of those instruction booklets, and we call them genes, then you can't make the protein. Cystic fibrosis is a disease that is driven by one of those instruction booklets or genes having a change in it. Basically, nature has gone in there and swapped some words around in the instruction manual. So now you can't use that gene properly, and it will never build the protein in the way it needs to be built. And because of that, you don't ever have that protein in your body. And because of that, you have cystic fibrosis. So a very small change to one gene can lead to huge ramifications for the person. And that's why this stuff is so important. But it's one of the key materials that we have. Okay, I'm going to stop there. As usual, I've tried to be quick and I've failed. If you need to email me for any reason, then please, there's my email address. Please subscribe this and like it and add comments if you want to see more. And please tune in for my next episode when it's ready. Thank you very much, and I'll see you soon.